This video is going to show some graphic hunting related images. If you're going to be offended by them, then you need to stop now. Old Grumpy Hunter here. What are the benefits of using a heavy arrow? Do you want your arrow to do this? Or do you want your arrow to do this? First, you're going to say that a heavy arrow will be slow, which will increase flight time. Next, you're going to say that speed kills. No argument there. Both of those I agree with you, but let's return to those in a little bit. Why would you want to use a heavy arrow in these times when bow manufacturers are pushing high speeds? There are a few reasons for that. Increased momentum, increased penetration, increased kinetic energy, flies flatter, less noise from the shot, less stress on the bow. Blood trails are not predictable. Let's look at each of those in detail. But first I need to provide some information for this topic. The formula for kinetic energy is velocity squared times mass divided by 450,240, resulting in foot-pounds. Momentum is calculated by multiplying velocity by mass and dividing that by 225,400, resulting in feet per second squared. The speed of sound is 1,125.328 feet per second. We also need a couple arrows. For the sake of this discussion, the two arrows weigh 400 and 600 grains. The 400 grain arrow has an initial speed of 350 feet per second. The 600 grain arrow, which in worst case will have an initial speed of 310 feet per second, shot from the same bow without any adjustments. The speed of the second arrow is based on the rule of thumb: for every 5 grains change in weight, it will result in 1 foot per second change in speed inversely. For most of us, hunting with a bow is an up-close and personal hunt. Because of that, the max distance for this stock will be 30 yards. There is an 11.4% difference in the initial speeds. The speed at the target for the 400 grain arrow is 336.1 feet per second. For the 600 grain arrow, the speed is 301.8 feet per second. That's a difference of 10.21%. At the target, 30 yards away, the momentum for the 400 grain arrow is 0.60 feet per second squared, and the 600 grain arrow has a momentum of 0.80 feet per second. The heavy arrow's momentum at 30 yards is 133.33% of that 400 grain arrow. With more momentum your arrow has, it takes more force or resistance to stop it. That means it penetrates deeper into the animal. Penetration is directly proportional to momentum. In other words, the more momentum, the more penetration. The more penetration, the better chance of a pass-through, which results in a better blood trail most of the time. Many times, the animal will just drop. Furthermore, when the arrow shaft is still inside the animal, the shaft can and will help plug the hole, resulting in a poor blood trail. History shows that warrior hunters used heavier heads to penetrate armor, bone, and hide that the slightly faster arrows with lightweight heads could not. Never has a bow hunter lost an animal because of too much arrow penetration. The goal of every bow hunter should be to achieve the most penetration possible on the animal with the intent of a full pass-through. Dr. Ed Ashby. Even with the slower speed, the kinetic energy is also going to increase. How is that, you ask? It's because the formula for kinetic energy squares the speed. Comparing the two arrows at 30 yards, the 400 grain has 100.3 foot-pounds of kinetic energy. The 600 grain arrow has 121.3 foot-pounds at the target. The heavy arrow has 17.3% more kinetic energy at the target. You can think of kinetic energy as knockdown power. When you shoot a 95 grain bullet with a muzzle velocity of 3,200 feet per second, at 30 yards, the bullet has 2,057 foot-pounds of kinetic energy, which is why that bullet can literally knock animals down and cause traumatic devastation at the wound site. An arrow's kinetic energy is nowhere as powerful. An arrow with more weight, and when that weight is forward of center, the arrow can have the same point of impact as the same sight point at 20, 30, and 40 yards. Less sound and less stress are related to each other. How's that, you ask? When the bowstring is pulled back, the bow has elastic potential energy. This elastic potential energy in the bow is much greater than what's needed to launch the arrow. For the sake of discussion, let's say your bow has 100 units of elastic potential energy, and the 400 grain arrow requires 10 units of energy, and the 16 grain arrow requires 15 units of energy. That means the bow has to absorb 85 to 90 units of the energy. So what happens to this excess energy? It goes into the bow and becomes both noise and stress. The more excess energy, the more noise, the more stress. The more noise, the greater chance of alerting your target. The more stress, the greater chance of a failure. Let's get back to flight times and speed. Both bow and arrow manufacturers are pushing speed. This is because they want to push their products and use kinetic energy as a selling point. Remember the formula for kinetic energy squares the velocity. If the weight remains the same and the speed doubles, the kinetic energy quadruples. Yes, a 600 grain arrow is going to be slower, but how much? Looking at the 400 grain arrow, its initial speed is 350 feet per second. At 30 yards, it's moving 336.1 feet. It has an average speed about 346 feet per second and takes 0.26 seconds to go to 30 yards. The arrow has lost 3.97% of its speed. The 600 grain arrow starts out at 310 feet per second and takes 0.29 seconds to go 30 yards with an average speed of about 306 feet per second. At the target, the arrow is traveling 301.8 feet per second. The 600 grain arrow maintains more of its speed with only a 2.65% loss. At 30 yards, we're talking about 0.3 of a second difference in flight time. Your eye takes about 10 times as long to blink. Here's how fast your eye blinks. Did you miss it? Okay, take another look. The speed of sound is 1,125.328 feet per second. How is the speed of sound related to bow weight? Well, it's not directly related other than no matter how fast your bow is, it cannot outrun the sound of the shot. Graphic hunting related images and video follow now. If these images or video are going to offend you, then please stop the video and exit now. Blood trails are not predictable. I shot a deer that was about 28 yards away, well within my comfort range. The problem was I used my 30-yard line on the crossbow and the deer ducked. The arrow hit high with a pass-through. Broadhead hit the top of both lungs. There was not a drop of blood to be found other than on the arrow until the deer hit the tree when it was falling over. In this image, you can see that both the entrance hole and the exit hole are high. The arrow also clipped the spine. The white spot below and to the right of the entrance hole is sunlight coming through the exit hole. This table is a summary of what we've just discussed. Don't just take my word for it. Here are a couple thoughts on the topic from people with more experience than this old grumpy hunter. You should always use the heaviest arrow possible that has the trajectory that you still find acceptable. Dr. Ed Ashby. There is no downside. If you want to kill stuff, there's no downside to heavier arrows. If you want to get the arrow to the animal, that's one thing. Getting the arrow through the animal is another. Troy Fowler, aka the Ranch Fairy. Making heavy arrows does not have to break the bank, but making the arrow heavier is just one part of the project. Some of the ways are explained in my video, the case of increasing and diminishing returns. So where do you put the weight? Well, that's another topic altogether. It's discussed in Let's Talk About FOC and Arrow Penetration. When all is said and done, only you can decide how to balance the need for momentum, penetration, etc. versus the need for speed. Thank you for watching this Old Grumpy Hunter presentation. Please give it a big thumbs up. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel and don't forget to push the notification bell.